A young Filipino singer named Marco grew up in a tiny, coastal town where music echoed louder than the waves. And though life was simple and sometimes painfully quiet, his voice was the only thing that made the world feel bigger than it really was. And every evening he would sit by the window with the old radio his father repaired, listening to Elvis Presley. Songs that played like magic across the static, filled air filling his imagination with dreams no one around him believed were possible. People in his neighborhood often laughed when he said he wanted to perform on a global stage. They told him dreams like those were too heavy for someone with pockets so empty. But he never stopped practicing, never stopped whispering to himself that someday, somehow someone would hear him and feel the same spark he felt each time Elvis hit a high note. And so he kept singing even when his voice cracked, even when the world didn't cheer him on, because hope was the only treasure he owned. His mother remembered the day he sang, "Can't Help Falling in Love" during a small school event, her eyes filling with tears as she watched this quiet, shy child transform into someone braver, someone older, someone who sounded like a soul touched by music itself. And although most of the town forgot that performance, by the next morning, Marco carried it in his heart like a sacred memory. His father worked long hours repairing old boats, barely making enough to feed the family. Yet he always made sure Marco had batteries for the radio, because he knew how much those Elvis songs meant to him, how they shaped his dreams and filled their small house with something bigger than the daily struggles they faced. And as the days passed, Marco's voice grew stronger, more mature, more controlled. His range surprising even himself, and deep down he wondered if maybe life had carved a special path for him when he hadn't walked yet, but could almost feel beneath his feet. Years later, when a friend showed him the AGT Audition link online, Marco hesitated, his hands trembling as he stared at the screen, unsure if someone from his background could even dare to dream that big. But a small voice inside him said he had nothing to lose, and after a week of convincing himself, he finally recorded a shaky audition tape inside his room, using a cheap mic balanced on top of a stack of books. He sang his heart out, closing his eyes, so he didn't have to see the peeling paint on the wall or the tiny woven rug beneath him, imagining instead bright lights, roaring crowds, and judges sitting just a few feet away, listening to him like he mattered. The submission was sent with a quiet prayer, and though he tried not to hope too much, every morning he would refresh his email, his stomach twisting each time nothing appeared. And then one unexpected afternoon, as the sun cast golden light across his small room, he received the message that would change everything. "Congratulations, you are invited to audition live on America's Got Talent." The moment he read the words, his legs nearly gave out and he screamed, loud enough for his mother to come running, thinking something terrible had happened. But when she saw his face, trembling and filled with disbelief, she knew something wonderful had begun. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation and fear, as Marco struggled to gather money for the flight, the clothes, even the passport. Yet his entire community came together in a way he never expected, donating what little they had to help him chase the dream they all secretly wanted him to achieve. His father worked double shifts. His mother sold homemade snacks. Neighbors pitched in, and even strangers who heard his story online offered support, turning his journey into something bigger than himself. By the time he boarded the plane, his heart was beating louder than the engines. And as he looked out the window, watching the land disappear beneath the clouds, he whispered to himself that no matter what happened, he would sing with all the love he carried from home. When he finally arrived at the AGT venue, the scale of everything overwhelmed him. The massive stage, the bright lights, the long lines of talented performers from every corner of the world, each with their own strengths, their own dreams, their own hopes tied to this moment. And suddenly he felt incredibly small. He worried that he didn't belong, that his voice wasn't enough, that people like him were meant to stay unnoticed. But as he stood backstage warming up, an older woman approached him and told him, "If you made it here, you belong here." And those simple words steadied his heart. The crew called his name, the stage doors opened, and as he walked out under the glowing spotlights, he felt every heartbeat pounding in his chest, like a drum. yet he forced himself to smile, even as Simon Cowell looked at him with that famously sharp, unreadable expression. When Simon asked what he planned to sing, Marco swallowed hard and answered, an Elvis Presley song, and instantly the audience murmured, knowing how risky that choice was, since Elvis impersonations were either incredible or embarrassing with no middle ground at all. Simon raised an eyebrow, half curious, half doubtful, and Marco felt the weight of those eyes on him, like pressure he could barely withstand. But he closed his eyes, took a breath, and remembered the tiny radio back home. The long nights practicing, the sacrifices everyone made to get him here. And with one final inhale, he began. His first note cut through the air like a warm blade, smooth, deep, unexpectedly powerful, and in the very first second, the entire room froze, because no one expected that voice from this shy, young Filipino performer, standing on stage with shaking hands and humble eyes. As he continued singing, his tone blended effortlessly with the richness of Elvis's style, yet still carried his own unique emotion, something raw, something honest, something that made even the people sitting far in the back lean forward in disbelief, the way one leans toward a story you don't want to miss. Simon's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity, from curiosity to surprise, and from surprise to something almost like, his lips parting slightly, as if trying to understand how this unexpected talent had just appeared from nowhere. The other judges exchanged looks, not the polite kind, but the kind that said, "This is special," and the audience slowly began standing row by row, drawn in by a performance that felt like watching a spirit being set free. Marco hit the chorus, with every ounce of emotion he had ever held inside. Remembering the hardships at home, the dreams he carried, the hope he refused to let go of, and the audience erupted cheering so loudly that he nearly lost focus from the intensity of it all. Then came the climax of the performance, a long, sustained note he had practiced for years, a note that required absolute control, full courage and unwavering faith in his own ability. And as he lifted his chin and let the sound pour out of him, the entire room fell into a silent, breathless trance. People's eyes widened, some covered their mouths, others simply stood frozen, and the judges leaned forward as if they were afraid to blink and miss it. When the note finally ended, the room exploded into applause, so fierce and emotional that Marco almost stumbled back, tears filling his eyes because he had never, not once in his life, felt that kind of acceptance. Simon Cowell slowly stood up, clapping with a serious yet deeply impressed expression, the kind he only reserved for performers, who truly shocked him, and Marco watched in disbelief, unable to understand how this moment was even real. As the applause continued, Simon raised his hand slightly, as if signaling for quiet, and the room gradually settled. But the energy remained electric, the kind that only comes when everyone knows they've witnessed something unforgettable. Simon looked directly at Marco and said, in a voice steadier than usual, "That was unbelievable," and the audience shouted again, cheering loudly at the rare praise from a judge known for his brutal honesty. Marco tried to speak, tried to thank him, but his voice trembled, and before he could find the words, Simon did something that changed everything. He stepped forward, rested his hand on the golden buzzer, and paused for just 1 second, watching Marco with a gaze filled with something between admiration and emotion. And then, without warning, he slammed the golden buzzer with full force. The stage exploded in golden confetti, raining down, like pieces of a dream turning into reality, and Marco fell to his knees, overwhelmed, crying, shaking, unable to believe that this moment he had imagined since childhood was now bursting into life right in front of him. The music swelled, the audience screamed even louder. People jumped out of their seats, and even the other judges stood clapping, celebrating the performance that had just carved its place into AGT history. As Marco looked up at the golden lights swirling around him, he felt everything he had ever endured melt away. The doubts, the struggles, the poverty, the long nights practicing with a broken radio, the fear of never being enough, all replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and wonder. When the confetti settled and the moment softened into quiet applause, Simon walked up to the stage, offering Marco a handshake that felt more like a declaration. a moment that said you deserve to be here, and Marco accepted it with trembling hands. The judges each gave their comments, praising his control, his tone, his emotional delivery, and the unique blend of Elvis influence and personal authenticity that made the performance so powerful, and the audience continued cheering, refusing to let the energy fade. For the rest of the night, even backstage people congratulated him, hugging him, telling him they had never heard anything like that before. And Marco kept smiling, overwhelmed, almost in disbelief, wondering when he would wake up from this incredible dream. The video of his performance went viral within hours, spreading across social media platforms, reaching millions of views before the sun even rose, and people from all over the world began sharing his story. Messages poured in, fans writing about how his performance moved them to tears, how his voice reminded them of Elvis, yet touched them in a new personal way. And news outlets began covering his story, talking about the young Filipino singer who stunned Simon Cowell and earned a golden buzzer with one unforgettable song. His hometown celebrated, churches rang bells. People gathered in community centers to watch the performance on screens, and his mother cried as she watched it over and over, her heart swelling with pride every single time. As the competition progressed, Marco continued to give everything he had, each performance carrying the same honesty and passion that made the world notice him. And though the road ahead was long, filled with pressure, expectations, and the fear of failing after such a strong start, he never let it crush him, because he remembered where he came from, who he sang for, and why he started singing in the first place. He didn't chase fame for its own sake. He chased the chance to share something meaningful, something that could inspire someone else who felt small or forgotten, to believe that dreams were not as impossible as they seemed. And so, the boy, who once sang to an old radio in a small Filipino town, stood on one of the biggest stages in the world, proving to everyone, including himself, that talent has no borders, no limits, and no rules about where it must come from. His journey became a reminder that sometimes the greatest voices come from the quietest places, and sometimes a single performance can change everything. As he prepared for the finals, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning of a story, far bigger than he had ever imagined, a story that no one, not even Simon Cowell, expected.